Supreme Court just issued a razor-thin 5-4 emergency order, and the shockwaves are already rippling across the entire nation. This is the kind of decision that divides the country, ignites fierce political battles, and creates massive uncertainty about what comes next. When the Supreme Court splits 5-4 on an emergency order, you know we're dealing with something explosive, something where the justices themselves are deeply divided about fundamental constitutional questions, about the limits of government power, and about how urgently the situation demands intervention. This wasn't scheduled months in advance. This wasn't expected. This was an emergency intervention, the kind of extraordinary action the court takes when it believes that waiting even a few more weeks could cause irreparable harm. Right now, the Department of Justice is scrambling to respond. State governments are trying to figure out how to comply with or resist this order, and lower courts across the country are bracing for the legal chaos that's about to unfold. The conflict between states, federal agencies, and the judicial system is about to intensify in ways we haven't seen in years. And here's what makes this so critical. What happens next could reshape federal authority and constitutional rights for generations. A 5-4 decision means this could have gone either way. One vote made the difference between completely opposite outcomes. So, do not click away because we're about to break down exactly what this emergency order does, why the court split so dramatically, what it means for you right now, and what the next explosive chapter in this battle is going to look like. Let's start with a simple breakdown of what this case is actually about, because understanding the context is essential to grasping why this emergency order is so significant. At the center of this controversy is a policy, law, or executive order that one side claims is necessary for legitimate government interests, while the other side argues it violates fundamental constitutional protections. The government's position was that they had the authority, whether through statute, regulation, or executive power, to enforce this policy immediately, and that any delay in enforcement would harm public interests or undermine important government functions. The challengers took the opposite view. They argued that the policy represented a massive overreach of government authority, that it violated clearly established constitutional rights, and that allowing enforcement to continue while the constitutional questions were litigated would cause irreparable harm to those rights. This case was about whether the government had the power to enforce this controversial policy while major constitutional questions remained unresolved. Should the government be allowed to act first and face legal challenges later, or should enforcement be blocked until the courts definitively determine whether the policy is constitutional? That's the core tension that drove this emergency appeal all the way to the Supreme Court. The issue exploded into an emergency appeal because time was critical. Either enforcement was causing immediate harm to constitutional rights, or blocking enforcement was creating immediate harm to government interests, depending on which side you believe. And here's what makes this so much bigger than it might initially appear. This isn't just about one state or one specific situation. This affects the entire country because the legal principles at stake apply nationwide and will influence how similar disputes are resolved in every jurisdiction. So, why did the Supreme Court feel compelled to step in immediately with an emergency order? Understanding that decision tells you everything about how serious and urgent the situation has become. The Supreme Court doesn't issue emergency orders lightly. These are extraordinary measures reserved for situations where there's immediate constitutional harm that can't wait for the normal appellate process, where lower courts have issued conflicting rulings that are creating chaos and inconsistency across the country, or where the normal legal framework is collapsing and threatening to undermine constitutional governance. In this case, the court saw warning signs that demanded immediate action. There were likely tensions among lower courts, with different circuit courts reaching opposite conclusions about the same fundamental legal questions. Federal agencies may have been enforcing the policy in some jurisdictions while being blocked from enforcement in others, creating a patchwork of inconsistent legal standards that was untenable. The Supreme Court recognized that this kind of legal uncertainty and inconsistency couldn't be allowed to continue because it was either violating constitutional rights in some places or preventing legitimate government action in others. The court's decision to fast-track the case, to issue sharp language directed at lower courts that may have misapplied precedent, and to intervene with an emergency order all signal that the justices believed something serious was at risk right now. A 5-4 emergency order means the court was deeply divided about the urgency and the merits. But 5 justices believed strongly enough that immediate intervention was necessary that they were willing to take this extraordinary step. That tells you this situation is on a knife's edge with huge consequences depending on which way it tips. Now let's examine the government's argument and understand why it ultimately failed to persuade 5 justices. The government's core argument was that the policy at issue fell within their legitimate authority, that it served important public interests that justified any burden on individual rights, and that blocking enforcement would cause serious harm to those public interests. They likely pointed to statutory language that they claimed authorized their actions, or to executive powers they believed gave them the discretion to act. They may have argued that the constitutional challenges were weak or speculative, and that the policy should be presumed valid until definitively proven unconstitutional. But here's why that argument didn't persuade the majority. First, the government couldn't provide sufficient historical support for the breadth of authority they were claiming. If the case touched on constitutional rights with deep historical roots, the government needed to show that their exercise of power was consistent with how those rights have been understood throughout American history. They couldn't do it convincingly. Second, the policy appeared to represent an overreach of executive or state power into areas where the Constitution places clear limits on government action. The majority saw the policy as crossing lines that the government simply doesn't have the authority to cross, regardless of how well-intentioned their purposes might be. Third, the government's position seemed to conflict with previous Supreme Court precedent that had established important constitutional protections or limitations on government power. When the government asks the court to let them do something that looks inconsistent with binding precedent, they need an extraordinarily strong justification. So what exactly does this 5-4 emergency order say? Let me break down the ruling in clear, simple steps so you understand exactly what just changed. First, the Supreme Court blocked enforcement of the challenged policy at least temporarily, pending further proceedings. That means the government cannot continue implementing or enforcing this policy right now. Whatever actions they were taking under the authority of this policy must stop immediately. Second, the court's order likely includes specific instructions about what the government can and cannot do while the case proceeds. There may be narrow exceptions or specific circumstances where limited enforcement is still permitted, or the block may be comprehensive with no exceptions. Third, the decision takes effect now, not in 30 days, not after further briefing, but immediately upon issuance. Government officials, enforcement agents, and affected parties must adjust their conduct right now to comply with the Supreme Court's order. Fourth, the court's order sets the stage for full briefing and argument on the merits, meaning this emergency order is just the first chapter. The justices will eventually have to decide the underlying constitutional questions definitively. Now, let's talk about the 4-justice dissent, because understanding their concerns is important for grasping how precarious this decision is. The dissenting justices likely argued that the majority was being too aggressive, that the emergency posture didn't warrant this kind of immediate intervention, or that the government's interests were being undervalued. They may have warned that blocking enforcement would cause serious practical problems or create perverse incentives. Now, let's talk about the nationwide impact of this decision because the changes are immediate and they affect millions of people. Federal agencies that were implementing or enforcing the blocked policy must immediately halt those activities. That means stopping investigations, pausing enforcement actions, and ceasing any penalties or prosecutions that were based on the now blocked policy. States that were either enforcing the policy themselves or cooperating with federal enforcement must suddenly shift course, and state officials across the country are scrambling to understand what they're now required to do or prohibited from doing. Ongoing cases in lower courts that involve the same or similar policies are likely being paused or reevaluated in light of this Supreme Court order, because the legal landscape just shifted dramatically. If you were a plaintiff challenging the policy, you just got a massive win. If you were a defendant being prosecuted under the policy, you may have just gained strong grounds for dismissal or reversal. For individuals and organizations directly affected by the policy, immediate protections have been restored or restrictions have been lifted. Whatever burden the policy was imposing is now temporarily removed, and people can resume activities that were previously prohibited or restricted. The practical takeaway for viewers is this. If you live in any of the states where this policy was being enforced, your legal situation just changed overnight. Rights that were restricted may now be exercisable. Obligations that were being imposed may no longer be enforceable. The ground has shifted beneath everyone's feet, and it's going to take time for the full implications to become clear. But of course, this emergency order is just the beginning of what's going to be a fierce and prolonged battle. The backlash and political fallout are already starting, and it's going to get intense. The Department of Justice's reaction is going to be aggressive. They may file emergency motions asking the court to reconsider or narrow the order. They may issue guidance to federal agencies, trying to interpret the order as narrowly as possible to preserve whatever enforcement authority they can. They may coordinate with state attorneys general and advocacy groups to mount a coordinated legal and political response. State leaders in jurisdictions that supported the policy are preparing to resist or refile their own versions of the policy with slightly different language, hoping to evade the Supreme Court's reasoning. They're not going to accept this defeat quietly. They're going to look for every possible workaround, every procedural angle, and every alternative legal theory that might allow them to accomplish the same goals. Activist groups on both sides are preparing rapid responses. Those who oppose the policy are celebrating and mobilizing to defend this emergency order and push for a definitive victory on the merits. What happens next, and where does this leave us moving forward? The immediate next steps are critical to what? The Supreme Court will likely schedule full briefing and oral argument on the merits of the underlying constitutional questions, and that's when we'll get a comprehensive decision that either upholds this emergency order or reverses course. Additional emergency motions are almost certainly coming from both sides, the government trying to narrow or stay the order, and challengers trying to expand its reach or make it permanent. Major legal challenges are going to be filed in multiple jurisdictions, testing whether similar policies in other contexts are also unconstitutional under the reasoning of this emergency order. This ruling sets the stage for landmark decisions in the coming months that could fundamentally reshape the balance of power between government and citizens, between federal and state authority, or between different branches of government. The 5-4 split means this issue is deeply contested, and the outcome is far from certain when the court eventually rules on the merits. So, here's what I need from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think of this split 5-4 ruling. Does a one-vote margin concern you? Do you think the majority got it right, or do you side with the dissenters? What do you think the government's next move will be? I want to hear your perspective on this explosive decision. And make sure you subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next twist in this case, because trust me, there are going to be major developments in the coming weeks and months. This story is just getting started, and you need to stay informed about every turn. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.